We're back for another video in our series, The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. And Margaret and I are thrilled to be joined by Joshua Stanton today. Josh is the rabbi at East End Temple in Lower Manhattan. He's also director for leadership at Clal, which is the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. You do a lot of other things, Josh. I know I'd call you an interfaith leader and sometimes activist, probably as well. And Margaret and I are thrilled to be in conversation with you about the book of Esther, which is one of these gems, I think, in Scripture that in some ways sits by itself and takes us into a world and creates a world. And we're going to spend some time studying that in our own. But I'm really curious to start off how this book connects to Purim, which is, of course, a festival that you and people in Jewish communities celebrate, but is not a Christian holiday or anything like that. And so it's unfamiliar to a lot of us, nor is it one of the big high holy days. And so tell us a bit about that holiday and how it connects to Esther and where it came from and those kinds of questions all at once.
Like any good rabbi, I'm going to complicate the question and
There
then
you go.
answer one that is at least adjacent to the one that you're presenting. Uh,
Okay.
so I want to talk about Purim in the context of the Jewish year, and then the Book of Esther in the context of Purim. And so the Vilna Gaon, who's this extraordinary scholar from a few centuries back in what is now Lithuania, said that Yom Kippur, the most somber day of the year, the saddest day of the year, filled with atonement and reflection and personal change and growth, is Chag HaKippurim, literally the holiday most like Purim.
Hmm.
And what it gets to is the idea that both in laughter and in comedy, and in sadness and in catharsis born of grief, there is a great deal of change that can happen in terms of our self-awareness and our insight. And if you look calendrically, Purim and Yom Kippur are kind of at opposite ends of the calendar. One is fall, one is spring. And so they occur about 6 months apart from each other. And they're intended to force you to reconsider your life in every aspect of it. Yom Kippur in a sad and somber way. Here are all of the things that are tragic about my life. If this were the last day of my life, here are the things that I would regret. And then at Purim, a boundary experience filled with ridiculousness and silliness, and for those who imbibe a little bit too much alcohol, and all kinds of ridiculousness mocking our own station in life and in the world, making us reconsider everything that we take for granted, not just about ourselves, but our communities, and then thinking anew about what we actually want to do. So it is a very funny and silly holiday that is also deadly serious. And Yom Kippur is a deadly serious holiday that is also supposed to evoke mirth, especially on the way out of the holiday, and joy at life renewed. So they're deeply connected calendrically. And I want to talk a little bit more about Purim just because it's its own fascinating thing. But very clearly, the Book of Esther is the original artifact of a holiday probably born in modern-day Iraq and Iran, thinking of a couple of centuries after the Babylonian exile. And what is the book filled with? What is quintessential of Persian writings, Jewish and Zoroastrian and Muslim and whatever else? It's hyperbole, it's humor, it's absurd situations that force us, it almost creates a thought experiment that force us to think in different ways about ourselves and the world. And so if this was written in the 4th century and the Babylonian exile took place in the 6th century, of course, BCE in both cases, how fascinating that it took a couple of centuries of Jews being in exile, eventually of their own choosing in Babylonia, to start to take on the literary forms of the surrounding culture and then adapt and adopt it for Jewish purposes.
That setting is really interesting. We've been focused on the sort of return to the land. We just came through Ezra and Nehemiah, those kinds of things, but a sort of exilic and even sort of here a voluntary habitation of Babylon is the sort of setting of this. Is that Is that right?
So let me both ruin this class session and maybe future ones by tying it not only to the biblical period, but the present. So geographically, Israel is situated between two great powers and is a small coastal sea route that is not particularly fertile, except in lucky parts of the water cycle. There's a 100-year water cycle there. The power in the south is Egypt, and the power in the north is Persia, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, Iran, many different names, but the same general geographic area. And the stories of the Torah, and in this case, the story of Esther, or the stories in the Talmud, originate in one of those two places. And obviously the Exodus being situated much more in Egypt, and then the story of Esther and the stories of the Talmud, much more in Babylonia. And what we have even mention of in Ezra Nehemiah, originally a joint book and then eventually split, we have record of the fact that most people stayed in exile. So it was probably a priestly class that was exiled and brought to Babylonia forcibly. And then the majority said, life is great here. People like us. People let us practice our religion. It's not a bad gig being in Babylonia. Why would we want to go back? And so in the exilic period, and it very clearly stretches out from at least the Babylonian exile, there were probably, given that it was a coastal trade route, relationships earlier, but you're talking about it becoming a large population center, a large diaspora of Jews, and now creating a literary format that is a hybrid between the outside worlds and something uniquely Jewish. And you can even look at the story of Esther as a recreation of the Exodus story in some ways for a Persian setting. And I'm happy to give specific literary references, but the cultural piece is key to understanding it. Whether you buy my interpretation that there are intentional parallels between the silly king in Purim and the terrifying Pharaoh in Egypt or not, totally up to you. But very clearly, there is an archetype here being played with to dramatic effect that is then adopted in the Jewish canon.
Maybe we should say more about, or Margaret, do you want to say something?
Well, yes, but this is really your interview, Matt. But I want to say I want to hear more about that. I want to hear that argument and those parallels. But Matt, this is the next question's yours. So wherever you want to.
Well, maybe you can pull it into the. So you've got I think you called him a silly king. You've got Artaxerxes, or what is Ahasuerus, I believe is
Ahasuerus, yeah.
Who's the king of Persia and is a buffoon, but is also terrifying, and there's trafficking people. I mean, all the things that kings, emperors do, right? And it is fearful, and nobody dares cross certain boundaries. And yet he's a bit of a nincompoop, right? And so how does that characterization then work for the book, right? I mean, take us a bit into the way in which it's a silly story or a satire, but also deadly serious. And what does it mean? Because it's hard to laugh at Pharaoh in the Exodus story, I think. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Like, what's going on in terms of how he's being presented, how Ahasuerus is being presented? And
if you think about it, it's another story of Jews being killed. And in this case, it's even a foolish person can result in the killing of Jews. And so in that way, it's incredibly serious. It is, look at this clown of a king, and if he has the wrong advisor, all the Jews get killed. It's very straightforward in that way, that it doesn't take much. It is an old story and it is a new story. And insofar as, absolute monarchs had tremendous power, if they are not situated for that role, being a buffoon is really dangerous. And for a religious minority like the Jews, could be deadly. So that's the literal real story. In some senses, the idea of Jewish hatred being born of nothing and everything. Jonathan Sacks, the late chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, talked about it as a virus, that in communist circles, Jews are capitalists. In capitalist circles, Jews are communists. In circles that value power, Jews are weak and therefore undesirable. In circles that valorize powerlessness, Jews are powerful and therefore bad. So anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred takes on many forms. And Haman, the villain of this story, who plants the seeds of genocidal actions against Jews, just takes personally some minor offenses and decides to engage in collective punishment against the Jews, might have some existing prejudices or whatnot. And this is written by a Persian Jewish community that was very well integrated and very well situated, and was not, at least based on my awareness of the historical records, not experiencing widespread pogroms or hatred on the day-to-day, but understood the precarious nature of its situation, even as a well-integrated community. It resonates, by the way, very deeply for American Jews who, in major cities, just surpassed any other community, religious or ethnic, as the top victims of hate crimes in the United States. In less urban areas, not yet, just because the majority of American Jews reside in population centers in the US, but it resonates. We are a community that has somehow found a way to, in the face of prejudice, live the American dream, and somehow found a way to integrate. And yet we feel very keenly the precarious nature of our lives and are not sure that America will be our forever home in light of recent events and the way that our fellow Americans have responded to them. So it's a universal story for a lot of different Jewish diasporas about being, if you want to quote Amos, as a driven leaf, like never actually having a place that is securely your own, never actually being accepted by a diaspora. And even this idiot king can bring about the end of an entire diaspora community. Yeah. And so it is deadly serious. And then what is silly? The silliness is the body nature of the story. Very sexualized, very exploitative of women in a way that I think probably 2,500 years ago would have been seen as both horrific and funny, now primarily just horrific. It is ridiculous in the sense that a Jewish woman just needs to marry the king and then everything becomes okay. It's ridiculous in the sense that Haman, the villain of the story, the right hand of King Ahasuerus, is such a fool that he thinks everything is going wonderfully when his plan is coming undone. It's silly in the way that we read the book. If you listen to the trope, there are humorous twists in the trope itself. And whenever you recite the name of the villain, Haman, everyone boos or they use groggers, which are noisemakers, in the middle of synagogue. If you were to look at the way people are dressed in a synagogue while it's read, it looks like Halloween. You're dressed as all kinds of figures. And thematically, what you hear in a Purim spiel, in a story, in the way that it's told, it is a modern retelling of the ancient tale with modern villains and heroes. And I think it's a little too on the nose this year for us. So I don't know exactly how we're going to adapt it and adopt it in a way that is not painful. But it's supposed to give Jewish communities catharsis and relief and release around perennially being hated and perennially being the fiddler on the roof who's making beautiful music and could well slip and fall off the roof. And so it is a meta-narrative of the Jewish diaspora condition, a realistic telling of what makes Jews vulnerable. You can think what you want of prior administrations, but when you got a Steve Bannon running around as an advisor, Jews are in grave danger. And so that is what it brings up for us. Yeah. And that is why it is serious. And it teaches us an ancient Jewish response, which is laugh in the face of fear. Use humor as a way of telling painful truths about the world, and find a way to laugh, both as a means of preserving yourself emotionally, and because sometimes it's the best way to tell your story.
So what are the sort of strategies that Esther recommends? What is to be learned about survival from this?
Well, so the caricature and the interesting piece are both linked. Again, everyone always, for worse and better, projects their own reality onto sacred texts. It's eisegesis is a real problem, and when done with intention, can be helpful and meaningful. So Esther uses her body, even though she's clearly got a great mind, to endear herself to this idiot king who just wants to use women, becomes a beloved queen, and then takes risks, presents herself before the king in a way that is not invited, and therefore, at pain of death if he does not excuse her or welcome her presence, and then uses her mind. So it is a very interesting, it is a problematic and interesting discussion of women in the Jewish community. You could argue it is objectifying in the worst of ways. You could argue it is sort of suggesting all of the worst ways to get ahead in society. And then it's talking about, on the flip side, how people, no matter how they got where they are, if you're in a position of influence, you have to stand up and save your community. I'm thinking of Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, standing up and saying, I am the highest ranking Jewish official in history, and, probably never going to be a Jewish president, at least not in my lifetime. And I'm standing up to talk about anti-Semitism because I have an obligation as someone in a position of power. And it's that type of standing up for your community. And what a lot of well-integrated Jewish communities struggle to do, and I think there's a real sense of disillusionment right now. As a progressive Jewish community, we've stood with every possible group that has sought allyship and support, and pretty much nobody's standing with us right now, just speaking very bluntly. And so it is a moment for us to stand up for ourselves, maybe to reevaluate and renegotiate relationships, or to leave some relationships that were toxic to begin with other communities, but to stand up for ourselves, because there are some moments historically. It's not like in the story of Esther, there's a whole litany of other people willing to stand up for the Jews. It's Mordecai as an advisor and mentor, and Esther as the key player in the situation. The tragic figure in this is Vashti, the first wife of Ahasuerus, who is cast aside for refusing to denigrate herself emotionally, physically, before the king's friends. And pretty clearly, at least based on my reading of the text, the king wants Vashti to go sleep with a bunch of his friends. He wants to sort of demote her to being the status of a concubine for all intents and purposes, and to be available not just for him, but for his friends. And so she's the tragic figure because she is this strong, smart person in the archetype of Rebecca, who is hated because she's smart and unwilling to submit to all kinds of ridicule and absurdity. And then Esther is the flip side. She submits herself to ridicule and absurdity, but then uses it for good. So you could argue that they are doppelgangers, even though one is Jewish and one is not. You could argue that Mordecai and Haman are doppelgangers in the sense of advisors who play a key role, one villainous and one good. And there are questions about who the king represents. I would submit he's kind of a pharaoh figure. This is a recasting of a pharaoh figure. It is a very daring political play. If you think about it, you're Jews in Babylonia, you're still feeling like guests rather than permanent residents, and you're writing what? So it has to be comedy, because who knows who it was actually intended to represent by the original authors.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you taking us through all of that. I mean, everything from the way in which the book still has resonance and the way that gets used, the word eisegesis, or the way we read our own experience into it in our own place and time. And there is you made a case for the timelessness of it. I think in ways that are painful to hear, and also dreadfully important to hear too. So thanks for that. I don't want to move too quickly on to the next thing, but and you mentioned the misogyny in the book. There's the threat of violence in the book. The book also ends in violence. One of the things we've tried to do in this series is not run away from what we've called the uncanny parts of the parts of scripture that we might wish weren't there, but still have something to teach us as well. And so you've mentioned Vashti, who's just taken away from the narrative, right? In chapter 2, it just basically disappears. There's basically a contest of who's best in bed for the king then to pick his next wife, right? And it's women are trafficked. There's also a lot of violence at the end when Haman gets his comeuppance. How does
well, and by the way, the Jews rise and defend themselves.
Exactly.
So the order is not revoked, but its Jews are allowed to defend themselves and are encouraged to do so, and do so very effectively to the point of wiping out those who seek to attack them to a large extent.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting, again, eisegesis is a problem, but it's very bloody. It is very interesting on a lot of levels. There is the thing of Persian hyperbole. If you've read any other Persian books, there is vast hyperbole. So you could be talking about like giant clashes in the streets of thousands of people, or like 3 people in a bar fight. And it is really hard to know if there is any historical root whatsoever, what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And, the Persian Empire is very diffuse. That was one of its weaknesses militarily is, if you are from the Minnesota regiment of the Persian Empire and the New York regiment says, we need reinforcements, everyone from Minnesota waves and smiles and says, good luck, buddy, and vice versa, as opposed to the Roman Empire where it's all one army. And so who knows if this is about a very specific locale or this is generalizable to the empire as a whole. And so the big question in my mind is what motivated this? Obviously, there's Persian hyperbole about violence, about sexuality, about the idiocy of rulers and the ridiculousness of leaders. By the way, for Jewish communities, rabbis mock themselves. In very gender normative communities, like ultra-Orthodox communities, men dress as women and have to actually imagine what it is to be a woman. People do all kinds of things. There were, the first gay kiss in the United States on any stage was over 100 years ago in Yiddish theater on the Lower East Side. And why would that be a thing? Purim plays have been talking about gay sex and gay love for a very, very long time. So asking questions about gender hybridity, asking questions about all kinds of things that are otherwise off the table in the most traditional of Jewish communities are really there. And violence being one. If Jews feel disempowered, what is the most empowering fictional tale to tell? Of Jews taking up arms and defeating their foes. And so I don't know if the violence is real or it's a dream or it's a fantasy or what, but the violence is there because it is answering an emotional need of the people who wrote it or the people for whom it was written.
You mentioned earlier, thinking ahead to Purim this year and thinking about how to interpret the text to speak to them, but also kind of enact them this year and how that will feel. I'm wondering if you could sort of say more about that.
Yeah, the short version, the story of the Babylonian exile was one of diaspora and homeland. And whatever your political views, modern Israel as a state, Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis have made relatively uninhabitable, firing thousands upon thousands of rockets at civilian centers, kidnapping and killing and raping people. Whatever you think of Israel's response, the response is intense and perhaps even heavy-handed because of a sense of fear that Israel's viability itself is at stake. And, without going too political there, you add to that the rise of anti-Semitic incidents. We're talking 300, 400, 500% rise in anti-Semitic incidents since October 7th, depending on whose statistics you're looking at. think it was almost 400% according to the Anti-Defamation League. And Israel has never been more essential for American Jews because we're not sure of our safety here. And so, okay, if diaspora is not safe and homeland is not safe, what exactly does the world want for us? And the answers are pretty grim and dark. So forthrightly, I don't think my congregation is going to do a Purim spiel on present events because it's way too much on the nose and way too painful right now. And so we're probably going to do something, West Side Story version or whatever, something that's like quintessentially New York and endearing, because it's just not funny this year. And I'm not sure about a way to make it funny.
So real sort of sensitivity to the emotional location of your congregation this year.
And my own emotional location. I mean, it's an opportunity to laugh at your clergy and to laugh at your lay leaders and to laugh at your community as a whole. And I just don't feel like getting laughed at this year, in contrast to every other year that I've been a Jew.
Can you say something about, I guess I appreciate you taking us into that decision making, right? In terms of how will this book be performed? How will the story be retold? And and help us think through what are some of the, I guess, the tools at your disposal, right? I mean, part of it is, you said the West Side Story connection or how you dress up. Are there things in the performance, in the rhythms, in the chanting, or however it's vocalized, that also play a part in that you think are effective? This is getting at the question of how do you bring a scripture alive in a context beyond
so you
just
sort of
reading it.
You double down on the caricature. And so you caricature yourself and each other. Sometimes you caricature politics. I had a colleague who in 2015 did Make Shushan Great Again, Shushan being the Persian center of things, just as sort of a mockery of sort of the nostalgia trap of many people who were shifting to the right politically at that time. Thankfully not in the Jewish community by and large, but certainly the country was shifting in a direction that was deeply troubling for the vast majority of American Jews. This year I don't know what we'd laugh about again because it's another election year, but it doesn't feel funny. So you usually try to find a hook that is either personal, maybe I send out too many emails, maybe I'm like Mr. Empathy, and so all I can do is feel feelings, and so you have me be like an Eeyore type figure. You try to make a really good caricature of your colleagues. And so we have an amazing new cantor who was trained at New England Conservatory before going to cantorial school. And so like maybe it would be a caricature of her losing her voice or something like that. So you mock the strengths of the person. And in that way, it's really good natured. You don't go for the actual weaknesses. You talk about the funny strengths and you engage in thought experiments about your community and its leaders. And you do that about yourself too. So there have been years when I've been like, heavy metal guitar player or something like that, because I definitely have a bit of a metal streak once in a while, for those who know me well, both literally and metaphorically. There have been years when I'm Haman, which is its own interesting thing to get booed the entire spiel. It really does take something out of you emotionally, which is its own fascinating reality. There are years when our cantor will sing in a way that sort of helps you hear the text itself. Some of the trope can be done in a really silly way. So like in falsetto, or I've seen some people like literally they will take a helium balloon and get their voice really high that way. Apparently that's not good for your lungs, but be it as it may, all kinds of stuff like that. And so you try to find an appropriate and meaningful and healthy way to make light of everybody's roles. And in so doing, gain insight into the roles you play, how you got into those roles, whether they're comfortable for you, and what you do next.
This is a great conversation, Josh. We could take you for another hour or two, just talking about this, but we're at the half-hour mark. Purim this year is late March. 23rd. Is that right? I believe that evening.
Evening of it, yeah.
So we will be in Christian circles embarking on our Holy Week then, but that's a good time to remember. I think the performances, the worship, the celebration, and the seriousness that's going on in synagogues all around us as well, at least for our audience, and to
do
pray.
wonder if it's an interesting invitation, right? So, the Holy Week and Easter is as deadly serious as it gets, and for really good reason. And yet our people has found as a pathway to moments of redemption or redemptive feelings, humor.
Yeah.
Is there anything that is funny? I've often thought, again, I'm not Christian, and so apologies if I'm speaking out of turn. I've often wondered about like dialogues between apostles. Like what were they like sitting around a campfire? What were they like, were they roasting marshmallows and talking about their great times in the Galilee? Like what is going on for the apostles? And so I keep wondering if there are interesting things to be written in about them and about how they were. I've often, and I will start, making light of questions first, like in the Babylonian Talmud, there are stories of rabbis skinny dipping. There's clearly, there are a lot of gay relationships. Were any of the apostles potentially, even in jest, lovers? And were there other things going on that only if we give ourselves the space of comedy can we actually think ourselves into and gain unique insight on? And so that would be my invitation, is take Holy Week incredibly seriously to the point that you can even find mirth. And if you can do that, you might gain profound new insights about your own tradition and your own place in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh.
A total joy. Thank you.